Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at nihilism. Now there are many different kinds of nihilism, but nihilism in the context of personal identity is the view that there simply is no personal identity over time. There are no selves, there are no people. Nobody is speaking the words on this video, nobody is watching and listening. Obviously there is a human organism currently speaking, and presumably in your room right now there is a human organism listening. The point of nihilism is that, if we look at these photographs, we would say that this person is the same as this person. That these are photos of the person Jerry Garcia at different times. So, in virtue of what are they both the same? That's the question of this series. The nihilist says they're not the same. There is no enduring self that persists from an earlier time to a later time. Obviously, this is a very radical claim. Now, this kind of view has a long history in Asian and Buddhist philosophical traditions, but in modern Western philosophy, the most notable expression of nihilism comes from David Hume's bundle theory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Hume in this video. Now, I do need to say that what I'm presenting here may not be exactly Hume's theory. There are different ways of interpreting Hume, so we're going to use Hume's ideas to sort of develop a nihilist theory. Just bear in mind that when I attribute this theory to Hume, this is quite contentious. Right, so it's worth distinguishing two different ideas relating to personal identity, which so far in this series we've conflated. First of all, we can define what's called synchronic identity. At any particular moment, you are experiencing a number of different things. You are feeling various things going on in your body, you can see things, you can hear things, you might be undergoing certain emotions. Now, notice that these various states are all in some sense connected. It's not simply that in this room at the moment there is a feeling of hunger, and there is a visual perception of a computer screen, and there is an emotional feeling of contentment. What we would say instead is, Cain is hungry. Cain visually perceives the computer screen, and Cain feels emotionally content. These feelings and perceptions are all in some sense mine, and they are all experienced by me, so they are unified in that sense. So synchronic identity is what gives the unity and connectedness to our psychological lives. You don't just have sort of mental states floating free in the world. Mental states are always experienced by a particular thing, a particular person. Even very different mental states are unified in virtue of being experienced by one thing. So that the feeling of hunger is a very different kind of state to the visual perception of a computer screen, but the hunger and the perception are sort of unified in the sense that they're both currently being experienced by one thing. Diachronic identity, on the other hand, is persistence over time. This is the sense in which we say that I am the same person now as I was 5 years ago, even though I might have changed in various ways. This is a sense in which we would say that of those two photos of Jerry Garcia, that that the man in the one photo is the same as the man in the other photo. And this is what we've been focusing on in this series. But notice that the question of diachronic identity is dependent on the question of synchronic identity. Because to ask whether and in what sense I persist over time, that implies that there is a person who might or might not persist. It implies that there is a self, there's a me, and this self is what is referred to by the name Cain Baker, and that's what either persists or does not persist. So I hope that distinction is clear. Now Hume, at least on the interpretation we're taking in this video, denies both kinds of identity. Hume argues, first of all, that there is no identity over time. Strictly speaking, no object can undergo change. Any alteration to a person, however slight, simply destroys that person and replaces it with a new one. So you do not persist through any kind of change. Perhaps more radically, Hume argues that there is no underlying substance that, as it were, ties all our mental states together into a singular whole. When I say that, for instance, I am hungry and I perceive the computer screen, this is in a sense an illusion. There is no thing that is the bearer of the hunger and the perception. So, in fact, the very question, do I persist through time, is incoherent, because there is no I, in the sense of something that could persist. We'll look at Hume's arguments a bit more, and that should make his views here clearer. As always with Hume, we have to begin with empiricism. Hume was a committed empiricist, one of the major figures in empiricist philosophy. Now, to put it simply, empiricism claims that all knowledge derives from our sense perception. All of our concepts and our ideas have their origin in our experience of the world. Hume arrives at this view through his theory of the mind. I'm going to be quite brief here. There's a lot of literature you can find online if you want more detail. So Hume holds that our minds contain impressions and ideas. Impressions are divided into two kinds. First, there are impressions of sensation, and these are just the deliverances of the senses. When you hear a noise, or see a colour, or taste a particular food, these are all impressions of sensation. The impressions of sensation are our link to the external world. Second, there are impressions of reflection. These are the impressions we have of our own minds. So when we feel desires or emotions or volitions, we don't just have sensory experiences, right? There's also a lot of things kind of going on inside our own minds. There's not just things in the external world. There's also a kind of internal world. And so when we introspect and we attend to what our minds are doing, we have impressions of reflection. When I sort of feel, when I attend to the feeling of an emotion, or I feel a particular desire, that's an impression of reflection. Ideas are faint copies of impressions. When you put your hand on a hot stove, this produces an impression of pain. Now, later that pain might be gone, but you can remember that pain. You have an idea of the pain. So that the memory of the pain is an idea. It's a kind of faint copy of the impression. It has some of the qualities of the impression, but obviously it's much less intense and vivid. When you remember pain, it doesn't sort of hurt you like the original impression of the pain did, but it still has some of the qualities of the original impression. Similarly, if you experience an intense fear, well, that feeling of fear is an impression, and later you can remember the fear, so that's an idea of fear. Or when you see a dog, right, later you can remember what the dog looked like, and then you have an idea of the dog. Obviously, we can have both ideas of sensation, such as the idea of redness or the idea of the dog. These are ideas that represent what we have seen through the senses, and we have ideas of reflection, such as the idea of fear or the idea of anger. Now, impressions and ideas can be either simple or complex. If you look at an apple, well, that's a complex impression because you can break it down into its constituent parts. It has a particular colour. In fact, the apple will probably have a few different colours, different shades. It has a particular shape, a particular taste when you bite into it, a particular texture when you feel it. On the other hand, if you consider just the redness of the apple, that's a simple impression. You can't break redness down into any component parts. Redness is just a kind of pure sensation. In terms of your, it's not something that sort of has any parts. It's just it's a kind of pure thing, and it's simple. Now, collections of simple impressions, a colour, a shape, a texture, and so on, that forms our impression of complete objects. Okay, so central to Hume's theory of mind is the copy principle. This principle states that all simple ideas are copies of simple impressions. You couldn't have the idea of redness without ever seeing red, for example. You wouldn't know what red looks like if you'd never seen red. You see redness, and then that's what allows you to later have the idea of redness. Similarly, you couldn't have the idea of squareness if you'd never had any impression of a square thing. If you'd never felt anything square, or if you'd never seen anything square, Hume would say that you would not be able to have the idea of squareness, because all of the simple ideas that we have are copied from simple impressions. Furthermore, all complex ideas are either copies of complex impressions or they are built from simpler ideas. There are many ideas for which there is no corresponding impression. Think of a unicorn. Nobody has ever actually seen a unicorn, but the idea of the unicorn is a combination of the idea of a horse, the idea of a horn, and the idea of wings. And we do have impressions of all of these things. So the unicorn idea combines ideas for which we have had impressions. So ultimately, according to Hume, that the source of all our ideas is impressions. And that means that the building blocks of all our thought it ultimately comes down to simple impressions. That's where all our ideas, all our concepts come from. With this empiricist background in mind, we can outline Hume's argument with respect to the self. Basically, it goes like this. Premise 1, all ideas are derived from sense impressions. Actually, it can be either impressions of reflection or impressions of sensation. So I shouldn't really have put sense there. But anyway, all ideas are derived from impressions. So the idea of a persisting self, the idea of persistence over time, must be derived from impressions. But we have no impression, that there are no impressions corresponding to the idea of a self. Hence, we don't really have a coherent idea of a persisting self. So it's important to be clear about what Hume's claim is here. Hume doesn't just say that there are no selves. He says that we don't even have any coherent idea of a self. All our concepts must derive from impressions, but there is no impression corresponding to the self. So talk of selves is not just wrong, it's literally nonsense. It's literally nonsensical. If you're familiar with logical positivism, what the logical positivists would say about God, for example, they would say that God it's not just that God doesn't exist, it's that the very idea of God is meaningless. That's what Hume wants to say about the self. It's not just that there is no self, it's that actually the whole idea of a self is really just meaningless. There isn't really any content to the notion of the self. Now, the crucial premise here is the third one. And here's what Hume says about this. This is quite a nice quote. He says, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." So the point here is, the question is, from what impression does our concept of the self derive? Obviously it doesn't derive from any impressions of sensation. It doesn't derive from impressions of things outside our minds. Selves are supposed to be internal mental things. So we have to consider impressions of reflection. We have to introspect. But when we do, we don't find anything resembling the idea of a persisting self. Introspection reveals only particular sensations. You might at one time introspect a sensation of hunger, say a visual impression of redness, and a sensation of the clothes on your body, and a desire to get some chocolate cake, and so on. And at another time you introspect a sensation of pleasure as you eat the chocolate cake, maybe a sensation of coldness as you stand outside, and so on. But we never observe anything more than this loose collection of impressions and ideas that's in constant flux. That's all there is. There is nothing that ties together, as it were, our mental states. There is nothing that unifies them. There is nothing that persists through the many changes in our mental states. This is Hume's bundle theory of the mind. This theory says that we are just bundles of impressions and ideas. There is no persisting self. Now, Hume's view on this matter is really just an instance of a more general metaphysical position. According to Hume, bundle theory applies to all things, not just to our minds. So it's maybe worth considering what Hume would say about a more familiar example. Take a rat. This rat has various properties. It's black, it's furry, it has 2 eyes, it has a certain mass. Notice that we are distinguishing an object from its properties. So we seem to be assuming that the properties inhere in some underlying substance. A statement like, the rat is furry, implies that there is some thing, some substance or some object that bears the property of furriness. But of course, we never perceive this underlying thing. We only ever perceive the properties. And so it is with any object you care to imagine. All you ever actually perceive are properties, such as colour or temperature or texture or weight. Indeed, the very idea of an object or substance without properties seems to be incoherent. So Hume thinks that all objects are merely bundles of properties. That there is no thing underlying that bundle. They're just a sort of bundle of properties that have come together, and there is nothing that those properties inhere in. So what about identity over time? Well, take an object and change it radically. Let's say I take a hammer and I cut off 80% of the hammer, just leaving you with a bit of like a little bit of wood. You know, I cut off 80% of the hammer, destroy 80% of it, and you have a little bit of wood. Well, surely we would say that the hammer has been destroyed. But if we change the hammer very gradually, let's say we scrape off a tiny little bit each day, so that we have a very gradual change from the hammer to the stump of wood, we would instead be inclined to say that the little bit of wood is the same object. It's simply changed. I mean, obviously it's not a hammer anymore once we have just a bit of wood, but what we would think that we have a sort of object persisting through the changes. Okay, if you take a hammer and you just scrape off a tiny little bit gradually over many days, gradually going down from the hammer to the bit of wood, we would say that an object has persisted through these changes. I mean, as a more realistic example, think of an acorn changing into an oak tree. Obviously, the acorn and the oak tree are very different, but we assume that it's the same object. We assume that the oak tree was the acorn. That's a perfectly natural thing to say. If we had taken a photo of the acorn before it had grown into the oak tree, we would say that, oh yeah, this oak tree was that acorn. So we seem to have the conclusion that objects persist through gradual changes, but not through sudden ones. And the question is, well, why should the speed at which change takes place make a difference? And for those who think it does make a difference, how do we demarcate gradual from sudden change? Similarly, why should the extent of the change make a difference? Why does it matter whether I cut off 80% of the hammer or merely 1% of the hammer? It starts to just look kind of arbitrary. And so for Hume, even a minor change destroys the object. If I sort of scrape off a tiny bit of the hammer, well, it's not the same object anymore. The point is that since the object at some time t1 is very similar to the object at a later time t2, we're inclined to treat them as the same. We treat them as having an identity over time. But in fact, there is no underlying substance that persists through the gradual changes, and so secures this persistence. We have no impression of a necessary connection, as Hume might say, between the object at one time and the object at another. So all there really is a succession of similar things. I guess this is a kind of idea that's summed up in Heraclitus's famous slogan that you can never step into the same river twice. Any kind of change, right, destroys an object and replaces it with a different one. And since change goes on all the time, that means that no object ever really persists. And the same is true for our minds. There is no underlying mind stuff once the particular sensations and impressions are stripped away. There is nothing that persists through the changes in sensations and impressions. There is no me, no I, no self. When I use the word I, that just refers to a kind of succession of distinct bundles of mental states, but there is nothing that is the bearer of these states. One thing to notice with respect to people is that if a person undergoes a sudden and radical change, for example due to brain damage, we might be inclined to say he's a different person. Recall that in the first video we discussed Phineas Gage and fugue states. Phineas Gage was the guy who had the huge pipe blasted through his head, and this took out a large chunk of brain, which radically altered his psychology. The psychological continuity theory says that Gage was literally a different person after the accident. But for Hume, there is something kind of arbitrary about this. After all, if the same changes had happened gradually, we wouldn't say that Gage had become a different person. Throughout all of our lives, we all undergo significant changes, but the changes happen gradually. So Hume thinks Hume would say, this is just arbitrary. The simpler view is simply there are no persisting selves. Now, Hume's view raises a question. If there are no selves, if there is no personal identity over time, why do we assume that there is? Why is it such a... if the self is an illusion, it's a very powerful illusion, so why do we have it? Well, basically, Hume thinks that we develop a belief in personal identity over time due to resemblance and causation. My mental states at a later time strongly resemble my mental states at an earlier time. My psychology will be pretty much the same an hour from now as it is right now. Assuming that I don't get hit by an asteroid or something, I will have basically the same psychology in an hour as I do now. Furthermore, my mental states at a later time are caused by my mental states at an earlier time. My desire for food causes me to go and get food, for example, and that causes me to feel satiated when I eat it. We discussed these points in the first video. Now, Hume thinks that because of this resemblance between the earlier states and the later states, and because the former cause the latter, this misleads us into assuming that there's some sort of enduring thing that persists through them. But actually that there isn't. There's just the resemblance and causation, and really there is nothing that endures. There is nothing that persists. It's just a succession of changing states. That's it. Another part of the explanation for why we believe in selves is of course just convenience. We have to sort of, as a purely practical matter, we have this assumption of personal identity over time. We say, for example, Frank punched Vincent, because we might have to deal with the Frank bundle, as it were, in the future, and bundles tend to change quite slowly. So if we've observed a particular organism engaged in violent behaviour, say, 1 month ago, then we can be wary of that organism now, because that organism is more likely to engage in violent behaviour again. It is difficult to see how we could get by in the world, how we could organise and structure society properly without assuming that there are enduring selves. But this is a purely practical matter. This doesn't mean that we should, in our more reflective moments, actually believe in selves. We have to make the assumption for practical purposes, but that's all. So let's sort of sum everything up. Our question in this series is persistence over time, or diachronic identity. That's the main thing we're focusing on. Now, I think that we can tease apart two different arguments in Hume for the denial of diachronic identity. The first argument is a simply direct argument for the claim that, in general, any change in an object, any alteration to an object, destroys that object and replaces it with something new, but perhaps very similar. This is the argument based on the nature of change. But notice that this argument is compatible with the claim that there are selves. It's just that selves would turn out not to last for very long at all. Any change in a person destroys their self. I believe that the philosopher Galen Strawson has defended a view along these lines. He calls it the pearl view. He says that each individual is actually a rapid succession of different selves, like pearls on a string. So, that's one view that we might hold. I assume probably not a very popular one, but it's possible to hold that view. Now, the second argument is more radical. This denies persistence over time by denying synchronic identity. Since there is nothing that unites the bundle of experiences currently going on in this room, there is nothing to persist, right? So the argument goes like this. Diachronic identity implies or requires synchronic identity. So the question of persistence over time requires that there is a self. It requires that there is a unified mental being about which we can raise the question, does this thing persist? But there is no synchronic identity. There are no selves. Nothing unifies the bundle of impressions and ideas. So there is no diachronic identity. In discussions of Hume, I guess these two separate arguments might be conflated, but I do think there are different arguments here. So that's Hume's the sort of Humean case for nihilism about personal identity over time. Okay, let's consider some problems. The first objection is that nihilism is self-refuting. The nihilist denies that any person exists. So the nihilist must assert, for example, I do not exist. But it's not possible for anybody to assert I do not exist and be right, because the very act of uttering I do not exist affirms your own existence. Now, I think the nihilist can deal with this objection. We just have to be careful how we interpret the statement I do not exist. The question is what the I in the statement refers to. So the nihilist doesn't deny, for example, that there is a human organism speaking. If we use the word I as a way of verbally pointing to a particular organism, well, obviously, yeah, I do not exist is false. But when the nihilist says that I do not exist, the I refers specifically to a self or a person, which means a persisting entity that's sort of, a unified mind that exists over time. So I mean, look, there are mental states, right? There's no question about that. What the nihilist denies is that there is a person who is the bearer of these mental states. Basically, the point is that the fact that there are thoughts doesn't obviously entail that there is any persisting person thinking these thoughts. One way to look at this is to consider Descartes' famous argument, I think, therefore I am. As I'm sure you know, Descartes famously said that you can doubt the existence of the external world, you can doubt mathematics and logic, but you can't doubt your own existence, because doubting is a kind of thought, and the fact that you're thinking entails that you exist. But actually, as many people have pointed out in response to this, the fact that there is thinking going on, or that there is a thought occurring, doesn't obviously entail that there is a person doing that thinking, or that there is a person who is the bearer of that thought. So I'm not really convinced by the self-refuting objection. A second problem is that there are a number of things that the bundle theory just leaves unexplained. Most importantly, if there are no selves, how exactly are perceptions grouped into bundles? How do we distinguish the perceptions that comprise my mind from the perceptions that comprise your mind? Obviously, from Hume's point of view, that question is somewhat confused, because the phrase is my mind and your mind implies that there is some further thing that is the bearer of the bundles of mental states, and that's just what Hume rejects. Nevertheless, there seems to be a distinction between different bundles. There is a certain bundle of mental states in this room, and we can distinguish it from bundles of mental states elsewhere. So how does that work? That's something that the defender of this theory will need to explain. Another question we can ask is, what exactly ensures the consistency of the bundle? Why couldn't the bundle contain both the belief that God exists and the belief that God does not exist without any dissonance or tension? Why couldn't it contain extreme pain and total contentment, again without any tension? Remember, the point of the bundle theory is that there is nothing that unifies or connects these states together. But if that's the case, it's not clear why there shouldn't be totally contradictory states in the same bundle. Of course, one point Hume might raise here is that in fact people sometimes do have contradictory states, and that seems to be true in case that there are cases of sort of cognitive dissonance and so on. But I think that this doesn't really get to the heart of the problem, because this usually occurs in limited circumstances. So in some cases, people have contradictory beliefs, for example, but are unaware of it. Perhaps, for example, the notion of an omnipotent, omniscient and benevolent God is logically contradictory. But if so, it obviously takes some argument to work that out. So people who believe in God would not be aware of any contradiction there. In other cases, people are aware of the contradiction, but this actually produces cognitive dissonance. So a man who believes in God but at the same time believes, say, that the problem of evil conclusively refutes the existence of God would be in a state of mental tension. And that you have that tension. Why is that tension there? Why is there such a thing as cognitive dissonance if it's just a kind of bundle of separate states? Why would there be a dissonance there? Finally, of course, there are cases where people are just mentally ill, just delirious, and they perhaps can have completely contradictory beliefs, but those are unusual cases. So the question for the bundle theorist is, why exactly do bundles of mental states operate in ways that suggest unity, if they are not in fact unified? It's not really obvious why that would be. Now, all of these difficulties of spelling out bundle theory raise a further question. Given that we can distinguish different bundles of mental states, and given that these different bundles are they exhibit a kind of internal coherence, why shouldn't that be enough for personal identity over time? Hume seems to assume that identity over time requires that there be something that unites the bundle together and that persists through changes in the bundle. But why? Why isn't it enough that there are just, why isn't it enough that there's just a number of these overlapping states? Bear in mind actually that Hume comes quite close to what the psychological continuity theory would say. We saw that the psychological continuity theory holds that personal identity is secured by causation and overlap. There are chains of overlapping psychological states, with the later ones being caused by the earlier ones. But Hume would accept this. So it's not entirely obvious that Hume's theory really differs from the standard psychological continuity theories. And in that case, is it really a kind of nihilism at all? Or perhaps is Hume's nihilism merely semantic? So that's something that the nihilist who defends this kind of approach would need to think about. Why isn't it enough to say that there are different bundles and these bundles have a kind of internal coherence? A third problem, and probably the most significant objection to the bundle theory, is in attempting to show that there is no impression that corresponds to the notion of the self, Hume asks us to look within ourselves, to introspect and consider the various impressions we find. Now, the question is, if there is no self, what exactly is it that does the looking? It looks like Hume's very methodology assumes the existence of the very thing he denies. It seems like, if we are looking within ourselves, then what's doing the looking, that's the self. By analogy, suppose that one day I ask myself the question, do I have eyes? Where are my eyes? I can see that other people have eyes, so if I have eyes, I should be able to see them. But wherever I look on my body, I don't see any eyes. So therefore I have no eyes. Assuming I have no access to a mirror, of course. Let's assume I've got no mirror. I look all over my body, look at all the places I can see, and I don't find any eyes there. This is quite a silly thought experiment, but obviously the point is that the eyes are what do the seeing. The very act of looking at my body to try to see my eyes itself establishes that I do have eyes. And of course I can't directly see my own eyes, but I know I do have eyes because I can see other things. So similarly, obviously you're not going to have any impression that corresponds to the self, because the self is what experiences any impressions. So it's just sort of confused to look for some impression that corresponds to that. It's the act of looking that establishes that there is a self there. So that's been quite a big objection to Hume's theory. A fourth objection, of course, is that Hume's argument depends on his commitment to empiricism, but empiricism is very controversial. I won't go into this here because it would be a huge tangent, but over the 20th century there have been some major criticisms of the empiricist program. Noam Chomsky's work in linguistics, Thomas Kuhn and Paul Feyerabend's work in philosophy of science, and even among those philosophers and scientists who still have inclinations to empiricism, none of them would develop it in quite the way Hume does. So we might, that's another way we could go if you want to reject Hume's theory, is reject his methodology, his empiricist methodology. Finally, even on the empiricist view, is it true that the concept of the self cannot be derived from impressions? As noted, we shouldn't expect to have any direct impression of the self, but that doesn't mean we can't derive it from impressions in a more roundabout way. Remember that Hume does grant that complex ideas can be built by combining simpler ideas derived from impressions. So maybe the self, although there isn't an immediate impression that corresponds to it exactly, we can build the idea by combining different impressions. So here's one thought that this is one way we might go. We have impressions of certain mental states, pains, emotions, hopes, desires, beliefs. Whenever I'm conscious, I'm having impressions of mental states. These mental states are associated with a specific body, and I know that they're associated with a specific body because I constantly have impressions of the same body, and I have impressions of it from the inside, as it were. The impressions that I have, the sense impressions I have, seem to sort of place me inside a head. And of course, we also have impressions of other bodies, but we have no impressions of the mental states associated with them. When I see another person's body, I have no direct impression of their beliefs or their pains or emotions. I can tell if they're in pain, but that's through kind of making inferences based on their behaviour. I don't feel their pain like I feel the pains associated with this body. So what I'm suggesting here is that we can build a sense of being alone in one's head, basically, by combining impressions of mental states and impressions of physical bodies. I can arrive at the notion of myself as distinct from other people. Okay, I have this body, and the mental states that I experience are, as it were, attached to this body. There are other bodies, and I can assume that they have mental states as well based on their behaviour, but I don't have any direct, I don't feel their mental states in the way that I feel my own. So, I don't know, maybe this allows us to arrive at the idea of a persisting self. At least it does seem to be enough to establish an idea of myself as distinct from other people. Maybe that would be one way we can go. Actually, we can build an idea of the self from impressions. Okay, so nihilism obviously has some quite radical implications. Most notably, it rather changes how we should think about death. Many of us fear our own deaths. When I die, I will cease to exist. I will disappear permanently. Since I rather enjoy existence, this is a fairly unpleasant thought. But on the nihilist view, it really makes very little sense to fear my death, because, strictly speaking, I don't exist right now either. I've never existed. At least, I've never existed in the sense of having a persisting personal identity. Now, it's true that in 100 years I won't be here anymore, but I won't be here in 10 years either. Maybe in 10 years there will be a philosopher called Cain Baker wandering around the world, but that person will not be me. Indeed, the person called Cain Baker who uploads this video to YouTube after it's finished processing will not be me. What is it that we fear when we fear death? It's not that we fear the loss of the particular bundle of mental states that defines me as I am at the moment. That bundle is in constant flux, and that doesn't produce any fear. Indeed, perhaps the bundle will radically change. Perhaps I will experience some severe brain damage that radically alters my psychology. This might make me afraid, but that's not quite the same as the fear of death. The fear of death is something deeper. It's not just a fear of change. It's a fear that my very ego, my very self, is threatened. I assume that my self, which has persisted from my birth or whenever until now, will one day cease to exist. Now, nihilism suggests that this is irrational. Myself will not cease to exist because it doesn't exist in the first place. Furthermore, much of the frustration and suffering that arises from unfulfilled desires isn't rational either. Let's say I desire to own a particular book, and I've ordered the book, I'm waiting for it to arrive, I'm getting irritated because it's taking too long. Or perhaps I know that I have a really great holiday planned for a few weeks' time, I'm feeling frustrated because it's too long to wait. I want it sooner. On the nihilist view, again, this doesn't really make much sense. The vast majority of desires will never, even in principle, be fulfilled. It makes no sense to get impatient about getting things in the future because you are a mere bundle of mental states, and this bundle of mental states will not persist even for 10 minutes, let alone for weeks. So you should therefore simply try to appreciate your immediate experiences, whatever they happen to be. Even if you're going on holiday tomorrow, or even if you're going on holiday in an hour, you will not experience that. A desire for something in the future is a desire that cannot possibly be satisfied. So you should instead turn your attention to the kind of immediate experiences and just learn to appreciate the moment that you are in. As I mentioned earlier, nihilism about personal identity is quite popular in Buddhist traditions, and these sort of comments about death and learning to appreciate the moment and so on maybe explain why this kind of view might be appealing to those traditions. If you're interested in alternative approaches to philosophy, it might be worth checking out some of the Buddhist writings on the self. I don't really know enough about it to go into it, but that might be something that you could follow up if you find nihilism interesting. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.